30th of July 1941, Army G3 sends Army G4 a characteristics requirement memorandum for a mass production low-cost vehicle, primarily a tank destroyer, but capable of alternate roles. It would have high mobility, be of lightweight with light armor, have a low profile, and be armed with a 37mm gun. Now remember, at this time Tank Destroyer branch is still setting up shop. The vehicles with which they would enter the war, the 37mm M6 and the 75mm M3, hadn't yet had their prototypes built, let alone entered service. At the time, the 37 was still considered to be a viable anti-tank gun, especially for the light platoon of the Tank Destroyer companies. A few design studies later, October 1941, the Ordnance Committee authorizes procurement of 8 pilot vehicles, 4 each from Ford and Fargo. Each company will produce 2 designs, one a 6x6, one a 4x4, and 2 pilots of each type. The Fords, they were going to be the T-22 series, the Fargos, the T-23s. At their own cost, Studebaker also entered the fray. They put in the T-43, and since form tends to follow function a lot, the 3 types of vehicle actually looked all fairly similar. Tank Destroyer Command started to favor the T-23, the Fargo product, so interest in the Ford and Studebaker began to wane. But by early 42, the 37 was starting to become a little bit less viable as an anti-tank gun. So the vehicles were redesignated as armored cars in March. There was a common practice at the time that when an agency came up with a vehicle or other weapon system, that would be sent around the other agencies as well that might have an interest in it. And so it was for these armored vehicles. They ended up being tested by Armored Force. Armored Force thought that there was actually a possibility for the T-22, the Ford vehicle, to be used as a reconnaissance vehicle. They'd had to make a couple of changes though to suit it, so they made the T-22E2. This was basically your basic T-22, the E1 was the 4x4. You remove the bow machine gun, you add a caliber 50, you change the electrics a little bit. Entered service as the M8. When it went over to the British, well, they gave it a dog name, and it became known as the Greyhound, by which it has been known ever since. And hey presto, one M8 available for sale at the Rock Island Auction Company's auction in early May. If you think about the vehicle as basically being a 6x6 truck with an armoured body on top, you won't be far off. In fact, the vehicle was going to be something of a stopgap until a proper armoured car with off-road capability was developed. The armoured body is on a 7/8 of an inch basis to the front, 3/8 of an inch to the side. Now when you hear somebody say it's on a basis, that means that's the effective thickness that they're going for. The actual plates are 3/4 and 5/8 of an inch, but because they're sloped, that's how you get your equivalency. There's nothing particularly amazing on the front of the M8. I mean, your standard collection of headlights and siren, and as mentioned, the bow machine gun is deleted. You move down to the wheels. They are the traditional split rim type, 20 inches, and they are mounted on leaf springs. If it's an early production vehicle, there are 11 leaves. If it is a late production vehicle, there are 13. You'll also see how it's a simple straight axle through the differential, and there is a simple steering system between a pitman rod, which goes to one wheel, and then there's a tie rod that steers the other one. Moving further to the rear, under the shovel is going to be your access port for the fuel filler. It's a simple spring release on the strap, lift up the shovel, take it out of the way. It's a little annoying, but there are worse things. And there you have access to your fuel tanks. Nothing too complicated. The Sponson bins in between the wheels, initially they used to be racks for mines. There would be 3 anti-tank mines on each side. Later on, I guess they figured that they really needed the stowage space more than they needed landmines, and that was the end of that. Little something to tie your goodies onto. Now what you will see is that there is no ring on the top for the caliber 50. That ring mount, which although fairly common in Europe, was not a factory production. The official place that you put the Caliber 50 is actually the pintle on the back of the turret. When you get to the wheels, the rear bogie is fairly typical of Ford trucks of the time. The weight is taken by the leaf springs, but the actual thrust, for lack of a better word, forwards or backwards, is transmitted to the body through the bogie by use of the torque rods that, one from each axle goes into the middle, and not through the axles themselves, as perhaps you might ordinarily expect. If you look underneath the vehicle, you see that there's a power shaft from the engine which goes forward to the transfer case. At the front of the transfer case, you will see the parking brake. It's a band parking brake. You pull the lever, it tightens the band on the outside of the drum. From there, one shaft goes forward to the front axle, and you have two shafts, a bit like we saw on the DUKW, that go to each of the two rear axles, which have, of course, their own differential. As we come closer to the back, there are more of these Sponson bins. They're not particularly large, but at least they're there. Taillights, well, you got a stoplight on one side and a marker light on the other, so no indicators. These don't really start showing up on American vehicles until the 50s, late 50s. Down underneath, you can have a quick gander at the suspension components. There's a shock absorber, and there's also a bump stop, which is fairly easily visible. The exhaust pipe and muffler are crosswise underneath, just above which is your towing pintle. Probably nothing that you haven't seen before at this stage. Although there is no track tensioning system, which fills me with sadness. The engine deck itself, the hood is held in place by use of these little wing nuts. It's surprisingly heavy. I'll open that in a moment. But before I do so, you can also see on that mounting point for the Caliber 50, it is also the plate which is removed in order to dismount the 37mm gun. So let's open up some of these. It is quite heavy, so I have to do it from up top. Open and open. I must now figure out how to climb onto the vehicle. The obvious solution seems to be to use the pintle as a step. Yeah, that could be harder. Now, what you couldn't see as I lifted up the engine deck on the left side was a look of some confusion, as it seemed to be a little bit less crowded inside than I'd anticipated. So I've now opened up the right side instead, and well, at least I know why I didn't see what I was expecting. What I was expecting to see was a Hercules Model JXD, about 750 pounds worth of prime inline 6-cylinder petrol engine, puts out about 110 horsepower, 238 foot-pounds of torque, and would be attached to a cooling system using 23 quarts of coolant, which, by the way, the manual says that if you do have to refill it, rainwater is preferred over any other sort of water. And that would be cooled, the air movement, by two fans at the back of the engine, which is the sort of thing I've seen before. Instead, I have a single radiator fan and an engine that says Detroit diesel. Now, looking into it, it's the 4-53N was a common conversion by export users, such as Guatemala or Mexico or so on. So I will also lay wager that the transmission to the front is an Allison, although I haven't really gotten down to take a close look. Now, the export versions that were converted usually had other changes done as well, either to the turret or the headlights or whatever. So quite what the backstory is to this, I'm not entirely sure. But again, it actually makes a good deal of sense, even as a collector, or reenactor at least, to have the updated version with the diesel engine. It's more fuel efficient, it's probably more reliable. It's just not original. And I did notice also that it's missing the drive shaft going to the front axle, which I don't know if that was a matter of they just broke it, or if this is also a reliability feature. It just makes it easier to maintain if you simply don't have the front axles hooked in to the transfer case. Under the engine you'd find the Hydrovac brake cylinder. The braking system is hydraulic. There are brakes on all 6 of the wheels. But what the Hydrovac does is basically a power assisted braking. So you put a certain amount of pressure with the brake pedal, the vacuum system increases the brake pressure, gives you more braking force, but the driver still maintains that sort of tactile sense of how much he's pushing down on the brake. So yeah, the batteries you may have seen are located on the left hand side. Not much else to be said for the engine deck, I guess, so let's move forward. And so we get to the turret, 7/10 of an inch all around, no roof, but there was possible to get a canvas screen that would snap into place and keep the worst of the elements out. Now you will note of course that my head is higher than the roof. Well, the seats I'm happy to say are adjustable. However, of course, the more I go down to bring my head closer to the side, the more my knees seem to come up. Oh well, can't have everything I guess. 2 seats, of course, the TC and the gunner have little round seat pads. As I say, they are adjustable in height, not forwards and backwards. There is no turret basket. There's just a little frame with places that I can rest my feet and keep them nice and safe. Traverse, well, it's an armored car. It's not a combat vehicle per se. And traverse is conducted, once I pull out the travel lock, by use of a hand crank. Obviously, speed of lay of a target is rather dependent upon stamina and technique, although later productions of the M8 had a 2-speed traverse. Elevation, also manual, 20 degrees up, 10 degrees down, very simple. Down by the feet there will be 2 triggers will be provided. The 37mm will be fired by a left foot trigger and the coaxial will be fired by the right foot trigger, and I guess the easiest way to remember it is 37's on the left. Gunner's optic is an M71D. It's a by 3 sight with a very simple reticle, and well, that's basically it for the gunner. The gun is the 37mm M6, very common gun of the time, although by the time you get to 1943, when these things started coming off the production line, its ability as an anti-tank gun is perhaps a little bit overstated. Certainly it is useful against armored cars or half-tracks, things like that, but in order to kill a tank, you've basically got to go behind it. But it can still be done. Which of course is the automatic segue to that most famous engagement between an M8 and the King Tiger, supposedly. The story goes, according to an eyewitness from a different unit, an M8 sneaks out from behind cover, comes right up to within 30 yards of the back end of King Tiger, puts a few rounds into it, kills the King Tiger, and then goes back into hiding. Well, it is long debated as to whether or not this engagement actually happened. Because if you look at the battle records, according to the Germans, there were no King Tigers anywhere in the vicinity. Although, I don't think anybody says what was in the vicinity. There are a couple of possibilities here. The first is that it actually was a King Tiger, and it was just one that had gotten detached from the rest of its unit. That was at Stavelot's. About 2 days earlier they'd passed through. Which is not impossible when you realize how often these things broke down, and well, tanks are not normally supposed to travel around on their own unsupported, because if you do, a sneaky little armored car might come up behind you and put a couple of rounds in your rear. Another possibility is that the vehicle was a Panther misidentified as a King Tiger, or perhaps it was a simple Panzer IV or Sturmgeschütz or something else that the observer from, as I said, from a different unit completely misidentified, but he was so impressed by what he saw that he thought it was a King Tiger. There is also the detail that the arse end of a King Tiger is a little bit too thick for a 37 to punch through. At least, so say the paper specifications. Although reality has a way of not caring what the paper specifications say. So that argument is a bit of a non-runner. Overall though, I don't think we ever will know what truly happened with that M8 at Soundbeat. We know it killed something. At least we're fairly sure it killed something. As for what it is, well, your speculation is as good as anybody else's. So in addition to the AP round, of course, it had a very useful canister round, which you could fire. And, well, it's better than nothing at all in a light vehicle like this. And so the TC side, he is of course responsible not only for commanding the car, but also the maintenance of the 1919 A4 coaxial machine gun, which as you can see feeds over the top to the ammo on the left hand side. So of the 1500 rounds or so of 30 caliber, they'll generally be stowed on the lower left sponson where the gunner could grab hold of it. Then he feeds it through, the TC takes over and feeds it into the system. On the right side, well, that's where the racks for the 37mm come in. 16 rounds will be generally scattered around the vehicle's turret. The remaining 66 will be on the sponson on the right side. Behind the travelogue forward would be mounted the magnetic compass. And yes, there is one on this vehicle, or at least would be. And okay, you got the big metal box into which the compass is rolling around the countryside. So that means you got to calibrate it. So there would be 2 screws that you would use to calibrate it. And the manual is rather specific in that it says that when you are screwing the screws for calibration of the compass, be sure to use something like a coin and not a screwdriver, because the screwdriver is probably made of a ferrous metal and will generally mess you up. There really isn't much else to be said for the TC side. Of course, the 2 boxes of caliber 50 might be found down in between the TC and the gunner. And well, that's basically it. He would be using the caliber 50 if the ring mount was mounted. Otherwise, it's on the back in an AA mount, so you'd have to spin the turret the whole way around if you wanted to shoot at something to your front. Or you simply get out and stand on the back, or better yet, you ask somebody else to expose themselves and shoot with the caliber 50 while you stay inside your armored vehicle. I've come into the driver's seat and it took me quite a while to slither in because this huge steering wheel only leaves maybe 6 inches between the bottom of the wheel and the seat cushion. The seat cushion is directly on the whole floor, but it's not quite as bad as all that because there's a downslope for the axle, which is under my thighs. So I do have room for my legs. I can actually drive this vehicle. The assistant driver has all the room in the world because he's got no pedals or anything else. It's just a downslope to the front armor plate. So he's sorted. He doesn't have anything to shoot with. He doesn't drive. Yeah, he does have the map case to his right. And I guess he can handle communications on the radio. The steering wheel, of course, is large because of the lack of power steering. And the control panel is laid out more or less as you would expect, although I also suspect there may be some changes because of the engine. So to see out when buttoned up, well, first thing you got to do is button up. So I do have this sort of bulge for the head, and you pull out, well, you don't use your left hand because what will happen is you will get caught in between the armor plate and the handle here. It levers down, simple enough. And then you could release the locking latch here. This handle folds up and it allows you to pull down this plate as well. Except you do it in the other sequence. So I am now buttoned up inside my M8. There will be a periscope I can look at here, or if necessary, there is a simple direct vision slit. Absolutely nothing between you and the enemy, but it is the backup if your periscope is offline. And that's it. So you're driving a little bit off to one side. You have a similar slit over on your left here. And well, there you go, nice and cozy for the limit that the amount of armor protection it provides you. So yeah, let me try to get out of here now. This happens first, so I can pull down on this. Okay, and then I can push up on this. Use this handle to make it go nice and slow into the latch and down. The pedals are pretty much as you would expect: clutch, brake, accelerator, hand throttle. The parking brake is a big lever way at the back here. Gear shift. The gear shift is a little bit different than you ordinarily would expect.
Again, this seems to have been modified from the original. The original gear pattern was a bit different, but this one has low is forward and left, then 2, 3, 4, 5 in the sequence you might imagine, then reverse forward, far right and forward. But the original one is back and right will be first. Make of that what you will. There doesn't seem to be any point in my sitting in the co-driver's seat, so I should attempt to scurry out now, which has to be done by putting my legs all the way into the co-driver's position, rotating 90 degrees, and then getting out.
In my hurry to get out, I forgot to mention a few things. There were two levers that you also saw on either side of the gear shift. The one on the left was the transfer case. The transfer case basically just doubles the gearing ratio. On the right side was the front axle engage/disengage. And it was recommended if you're going to engage the front axle, do so at slow speed. Maximum speed was 56 in high range, 8 in reverse, and half that for low gear. The manual repeatedly observes that the original engine did not have any form of governor, so it was up to the driver to ensure that he didn't over-rev the engine. Turning circle, 27 feet radius. If you did start getting into trouble off-road and you've engaged front-wheel drive and you've engaged low range, it was possible to add chains, I mean honest to God chains, to the wheels to give you a little bit extra traction. Opinions as to the overall effectiveness of the off-road capability of the vehicle tend to vary. Some people loved it, and it's quite possible that if what you were used to before wasn't all that great, then yes, this will be an improvement. But remember, this was an interim vehicle with straight axles. Armored Force were looking for something a little bit better, and indeed a number of other designs were tried. Although in the end, none of them entered service. There was continued development of armoured cars, the Staghound being the most famous example, but even if you go to Bovington today, you'll see the Boarhound 8x8 was an interesting attempt. The Boarhound, unfortunately, it's in the VCC now, it's not on public display. It used to be, but it is still there. Anyway, a grand total of 8,523 of the M8s were built by the time Ford shut down the assembly line in May of 1945. There was a requirement from Tank Destroyer Command for a command and supply vehicle, and they thought that the M8 chassis would do nicely. So what they did was they took the turret off, they made an open top, they put a skate ring for the 50 caliber, and they developed the Armoured Utility Car M10. Fantastic, as Tank Destroyer branch, it enters production. Then it was observed that there were already a large number of M10s in a Tank Destroyer unit, and things might start getting confusing. So the vehicle was redesignated the M20, and that's how we came to know and love the 6x6 open-topped vehicle that we're familiar with today. About 3,800 of those were built. There was an attempt to make a multiple gun motor carriage with a quad 50. It was the T69. However, that proved not to be anywhere near as successful as the M16 we saw before, so that was the end of that. When I was done filming the section on the engine deck, I did a little bit of digging around to find out the backstory of this vehicle, and it turns out that it is indeed an ex-Guatemalan one, and Guatemala did the full conversion. They also made some changes to the exterior appearance, so this vehicle has been backdated to look a lot more like a World War II configuration. But you know the way sometimes you look at a vehicle and there's a little voice inside your head saying, something looks wrong, but you ignore it because you can't quite place your finger on what it is? It's the engine deck. The thing's this much higher than it should be. So had I noticed that, or at least paid more attention to it, I would have not been as surprised when I opened it up. Anyway, thus ends the tour of the M8. This vehicle, as I say, is on sale at the beginning of May. So if you come back towards the end of May, I should have updated the text description at the bottom to let you know how much the vehicle sold for if you have an interest in such things. Right, that's it. Time for me to move this vehicle out of the way and move the next one into place. It's handy to have a step there. I have to do this, hang on.
Himself. So you pull down on this lever with your other hand because your left hand will get crushed between the pieces of metal. I meant to do that?
This is great. So I'm alternating. When he stops, I start talking. When he's waiting for me to stop talking, then he hits away with the hammer, or the saw, or the nail gun.